We're extremely lucky to live in a time where we can search the internet anytime we want to know something. Every year, Google releases data on what the most searched terms were for that year. So it had me wondering, if Google existed 100 years ago, what would be the most searched term every year between 1923 and 2023? The last 100 years have been very eventful, from world wars to presidential assassinations to global pandemics, so I think it makes for a very interesting video. This is Google's most searched term every year for the last 100 years. Tutankhamun. You've definitely heard of him. In February of 1923, the seal to his tomb was broken, and his tomb was re-entered for the first time in over 3,000 years. Over the next few months, King Tut fever would grip the world. Another very famous man. Following the death of Lenin on the 21st of January, a 45-year-old Joseph Stalin would become the new leader of the Soviet Union. He would begin a purge of his main political rivals, the most famous of them being Leon Trotsky, who Stalin exiled. If there's one thing you should know about Stalin, it's that he did not mess around. After teaching students in a Tennessee high school about, cover your ears for this one, evolution, the state prosecuted science teacher John Thomas Scopes because state laws prohibited any teachings that went against biblical beliefs. He was found guilty and fined $100, which would be just over $1,500 in 2023. Yeah, I know, 40-hour work weeks suck. In 1926, Ford Motor Company announced that they'll be implementing a 40-hour workweek for factory workers, with Saturdays and Sundays off. They were the first company to popularize this idea. At the time, it was common for workers to work 60+ hours without any extra pay, so this new idea was quite revolutionary. Oh shoot. Well, seeing as you're already here, you might as well like the video and subscribe. Now, where was I? Spoiler alert, yes it is. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh becomes the first person to fly solo over the Atlantic Ocean non-stop, flying from New York City to Paris. A Scottish physician named Alexander Fleming observed that putting a certain fungus with some bacteria killed that bacteria. This fungus was a penicillin mold, and would later be made into the drug we now know as penicillin. The Roaring Twenties. What a time to be alive. It's the decade after World War I, categorized by great wealth and excess, until it came to a crashing halt in 1929, when the US stock market crashed. It's one of the main reasons for the Great Depression, and is still the worst stock market crash in the history of the United States. You never know, maybe 2023 can change that. In 1930, Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese independence fighter, creates the Communist Party of Vietnam to try and kick out French colonial occupiers. This would have a huge effect on world politics decades later, in a war we now call the Vietnam War. After only 13 months of construction, the Empire State Building opens up on May 1st, 1931. It becomes the tallest building in the famous Manhattan skyline, and will remain the tallest for another 42 years. (1932). Amelia Earhart becomes the first woman to fly a solo, non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. This propelled her to fame and made her an icon for feminists of the 30s. A good question, especially considering 1933 was the year that unemployment rates reached a peak. The US unemployment rate was at an all-time high of 25%. In Australia, it peaked at 32%, and in the UK, it peaked at 23%. I have a feeling you might know who this is, but remember, it's 1934, and Hitler is pretty much unknown outside of Germany. After the death of Germany's President Paul von Hindenburg, a popular German nationalist called Adolf Hitler assumes leadership of Germany. This would be the first major step in the events that would lead to the deadliest war in history, World War II. In January 1935, the first can of beer is sold in Richmond, Virginia. Revolutionary stuff, that is. At a time where the beliefs of racial purity and superiority are on the rise, Jesse Owens, an African-American sprinter from Alabama, wins 4 gold medals at the Olympic Games in Germany. With Adolf Hitler in the stands, Owens showed the world the only race that matters, a running race. In May 1937, the Hindenburg airship burst into flames, killing 36 people in total. Footage of the accident was broadcast the next day, killing the giant airship market before it even took off. The footage was broadcast on TV because remember, YouTube didn't exist in 1937. I wonder what the most viral YouTube videos would be if it did exist. Maybe that's a video for another day. Between March 12 and March 13, Germany invaded Austria and annexed it as part of its newly formed Nazi Germany. This was the first major step that would lead to World War II. What happens over the next few years is dark, so buckle up. On September 1st, 1939, World War II officially begins when Germany attacks and invades Poland. France, the UK and Australia declare war on Germany, and the deadliest armed conflict in history would begin. The Battle of Dunkirk in late May to early June was a big loss to the Allies and a huge victory for the Germans. Soon after, Britain would withdraw all its troops from France. Less than 2 weeks after the Allies were defeated at Dunkirk, German troops would march through the streets of Paris. In December of 1941, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on a US fleet at Pearl Harbor. The US would formally enter the war the day after the attack by declaring war on Japan. 3 days later, they would declare war on Germany and Italy too. In the US, the minimum draft age is changed from 21 years old to 18 years old. Car manufacturers would switch from making cars to making war materials. In other words, cancel your summer plans, we're going to war. In May 1943, after being surrounded by Allied forces, the German and Italian troops in North Africa surrender to the Allies. The surrender meant that there were over 275,000 prisoners of war. This was a big loss for the Axis powers, and a big victory for the Allies. On June 6, the biggest one-day military campaign in history was launched. It was codenamed Operation Neptune, but it's more famously referred to as D-Day. It would result in an Allied victory. This was a huge win for the Allies, and it was a turning point in World War II. Spoiler alert, it did. The surrender of Japan officially marks the end of World War II, the deadliest armed conflict in human history. The war would leave an estimated 70 to 85 million people dead, with tens of millions of others injured. The Nuremberg trials was a public international court trial held by the Allied forces. At the trials, former Nazi leaders were tried as war criminals. On the 1st of October, the Nuremberg trials would end. Of the 20 accused, 19 would be found guilty. Of those 19, 12 were sentenced to death, while the rest would serve prison sentences. After many years of hard work from Indian nationalists like Gandhi, India finally gains independence from Britain and becomes the world's largest democracy. That took a quick turn. On the 30th of January, less than 6 months after India gained independence from British rule, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. He was shot 3 times in the chest by Nathuram Godse, a man who twice previously tried to assassinate Gandhi. If you're watching this, then you should know damn well who NATO are. But it's 1949. NATO is less than a year old, and tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States are rising. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is formed between the United States and its Western European allies. NATO was formed to reduce the chances of the Soviet Union directly attacking any of the NATO countries, as an attack on any NATO member would be considered an attack on all NATO members. You can't blame the people in 1950 for thinking that World War III was almost upon them. Remember, the last 36 years gave them 2 world wars. It's 1950, and the North Korean army crosses the border into South Korea, with US President Harry Truman reacting almost immediately, sending troops to help the capitalist South Korea. The newly formed Communist People's Republic of China would help North Korea, and so a proxy war began. On June 19th, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were sentenced to death. They were an American couple from Manhattan, who were found guilty of espionage for passing along atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, both during and after World War II. They are the first American citizens to be executed for such charges. If Netflix was around, I would have loved to see them make the show Keeping Up with the Rosenbergs. It would have been a 1951 hit, I'm sure of it. On February 6 in 1952, George VI, the King of England, dies. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth, succeeds him. She was 25 years old when she became queen, and she would rule for 70 years until her death in September 2022. On the 5th of March, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, dies aged 74. Official reports from his autopsy say that the cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage, although many suspect he was murdered by someone close to him. The US Supreme Court rules in favor of Cheryl Brown in the case Brown v. Board of Education. The case started when, in 1951, a local school refused to enroll local black resident Cheryl Brown, instead telling her to ride a bus to a segregated black school much further away. Brown v. Board of Education ruled to unanimously ban racial segregation in public schools, stating that it is unconstitutional. Rosa Parks, a name not many people don't know. On December 1st, in Montgomery, Alabama, an African American girl named Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. Led by a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., the arrest led many African Americans to boycott Montgomery buses. Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. This results in Israel, France, and the UK invading Egypt in an attempt to regain control of the canal, although pressure from the US, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations forces Israel, France, and the UK to withdraw their troops.